Welcome to Late Edition Crime Beat Chronicles, a Lee Enterprises podcast. I'm Ambre Moton, the producer and editor of the show, filling in for Nat Cardona, who's taking some well-deserved time off. If you haven't listened to the last episode introducing our latest topic, the Osage Reign of Terror, go check it out before listening to this one. Today we're continuing our look at the series of suspicious deaths in the 1920s of members of the Osage tribe in Oklahoma. In the early 1900s, oil was found on the land that the Osages had purchased. The Tulsa World's Randy Krehbiel explains more.
The story is that for, a long time, Indians had known that there were these oil seeps, where oil would seep out of the ground and it'd be in springs and things like that. But through most of the 1800s, there wasn't really a lot of use for that oil. They would use it for like remedies and things like that. It was considered medicinal. And so, of course, it wasn't until the invention of things like kerosene lamps and the internal combustion engine that oil became more valuable. And so the first commercial oil well in Oklahoma, or what became Oklahoma, was completed in 1897, just outside the Osage Reservation, just on the eastern edge of it. And a couple of years later, the first well then was drilled in Oklahoma. And about that time, and so this was around 1900, and that was about the time we were starting to see motor vehicles and again, kerosene was already pretty popular. People tend to forget that the first use of oil, as we think of it today, was actually kerosene, and to use in lamps and things like that. So anyway, that was in the early 1900s, and around 1900, and by 1905 or 1906, they knew they had quite a bit. Right around the time of World War I is when it really picked up. From like about the mid 19-teens up through around 1929 was kind of the height of the oil boom in the Osage Nation. The Osages actually had relatively little control over their own affairs. Almost all of that was handled by what now is the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or by the guardians that were appointed. A lot of them had somebody who was appointed to handle their business affairs because they were not thought to be competent to handle their business affairs. So a lot of that was out of their hands. And also, I think a lot of them, especially the older ones, probably didn't even really completely understand what was going on. But when they first moved there, they probably mainly wanted to just be left alone. And it pretty soon became apparent that they were not going to be able to do that.
When did the Osage Reign of Terror really begin?
There's not really a definite date. So the Killers of the Flower Moon, basically, the book followed is a period from about 1921 to about 1929. But there were probably people dying as early as 1912, 1910, something like that. And interestingly enough, similar type things were going on in the adjoining Muskogee Creek Nation. The Cherokees had some of that going on. It was a different situation because with the Osages, when they started, they all had equal shares. So any Osage was worth, some sort of money from their head right. Whereas with the Muskogees and the Cherokees, their mineral rights were tied to their individual allotment. So if you were a member of one of those tribes that had a particularly valuable allotment, you could be targeted. And so in some cases, 1906, 1907, 1908, there were people who were disappearing, Some of them turned up alive somewhere else. Some of them were never found. As far as the Osage, yeah, it really began to intensify. It seems like 19, probably around 1920, and then it coincides with when the height of the boom. So the boom was really taken off in the late teens, early 20s. By the late teens, early 20s, it was pretty well subsiding by the late 20s.
A very quick reminder about the Osage's mineral rights. The original allotments of the mineral rights were divided into over 2,200 shares, which were called head rights. As people died, had babies, got married, etc., those rights began moving around, and you had some people with multiple rights and some with fractional rights. Making things even more complicated was the ability to pass head rights to non-tribal areas. I spoke with Randy's colleague Tim Stanley about the series of crimes that earned the name the Osage Reign of Terror.
I am Tim Stanley, a reporter here for the Tulsa World. I've been with the World for a little over 20 years. The Reign of Terror, I think that was a term that was probably coined maybe by journalists. I'm not real sure of the origins of it, but I know it did appear in some of the newspapers of the time. But it was a reference to a series of murders that took place among Osage Nation tribal members in the early 1900s. Specifically, I think they date them or officially to like 1921 to 26, about a 5-year span. Of course, as David Gran in his book has pointed out, and as we also did in our series, the exact years that this took place and the true number of victims we're probably talking about a much larger span than just that 5 years. But the murders were, committed by, there was a conspiracy involved, but at the same time, there were a lot of people just individually taking the opportunity they saw to cheat and exploit, and white people taking the opportunity to cheat and exploit their Osage neighbors there in Osage County. I think specifically the Reign of Terror, and the word terror there refers to, this atmosphere of dread and terror that really materialized in Osage County among the tribal citizens there after, I think, the first 3 or 4 killings. When it kind of became obvious that these were connected, and that potentially anyone who was a member of the tribe could be next. It was, as reported in the newspapers at the time, and as David Gran and others have chronicled, it was a time of heightened fear. You had many. This was, the electric light bulb, and that at that time was still a relatively new innovation. But for a lot of the people, Osage tribal members living outside of the town, Pawhuska or some of the other towns, they lived in the countryside. And Gran describes this in his book, but they began to put up electric lights on their properties at night in such a way that they just really shone for miles around. And they were doing that really out of fear, out of what might be out there in the darkness. Of course, as we would come to find out, it was less the danger that was out there in the darkness for many of these folks. It was less what was out there as opposed to what was inside and close to them. Many of the murders, as it turns out, were committed very sadly by people they trusted, people they knew, family members, close family members, spouses, people who would then have access to their oil wealth, which was really the motive behind it all.
How many victims were there officially?
Officially, this is where it's interesting. The number that has been tossed around for years, even before the grand book was 24. And where that
which
number,
is a lot in and of
that's
itself.
a lot. That's definitely, I mean, it should be eye-opening, just as it is, 24 people. Now, where that comes from, it's interesting. The federal investigators at the time who investigated this case and ultimately, brought charges, that number was one that they put out there. And I think their exact words were they believed that there were at least 24 victims. So they were even, in their language, I think, leaving it open for more. But the 24, that's the number that has sort of been, considered official. But that the problem with it, as we found out, and in our own reporting, and as has been reported, by Gran, the 24, is probably well short of what the true number was. The problem with the 24 is that, and it's given rise to so much speculation, is in saying that there were at least 24. Federal investigators didn't give or provide a list of those 24. So all we've been able to do, in retrospect, and that includes, the tribal members who've looked into this, is sort of speculate at the 24 themselves. Now, some of them are obvious. 3 homicides that ended up, charges being brought in that were investigated as homicides. But then you had many others that where just the circumstances were probably suspicious, but they were never investigated as homicides. It's just, it's really, in other words, it's really hard to come up with a definitive list of the 24 that, federal investigators, thought were victims here. You'll find lists out there where people speculate on who they might have been. And between those lists, some names are certainly they have in common. But they didn't do us any favors when they put that number out there all those years ago, and then didn't bother to elaborate on who that might be, all of them, outside of the ones in their specific cases. I think the best thing you can say about it is it's more of a starting point. I mean, it's a number that was put out there by the people who investigated it, so it's worth considering. But the problem is we don't even know who the full 24 were. And we now have reason to believe that there were many more in addition to that was never made the list. So that's where the number comes from, and just a little background on it.
I guess unofficially, members of the Osage tribe, do they have another estimate for victims?
And when we had a chance to sit down with some of the tribal officials, and we talked to Chief Jeffrey Standing Bear, the current principal chief, he said, once there was a time, many years ago, several decades, when they were sort of informally talking about this just amongst themselves, and again, very informal, he said, but the number they came up with would have put it at well over 100. Killed for their oil wealth during that time span, but it would have been roughly 5% of the tribe's then population.
Oh wow!
Which is pretty eye-opening. And he said, even then there were some of the older members of the tribe who maybe had, who were around even back at the time, who thought that estimate was too low. So the tribe unofficially, based on that very informal internal investigation, suggested or proposed well over 100. I mean, 100 compared to 24. So we're talking a death toll, really far exceeding that original estimate. But as, Chief Standing Bear pointed out to us, there's no way to do anything with that. There's no way to make it any more official than just that. It's pure speculation, because that's all you can do really 100 years removed from the events when the deaths were not necessarily investigated as homicides, and when all you've got are family stories or family suspicions. I mean, that's all you can do is speculate. I mean, it's nothing wrong with that. Speculation can be a good thing, and in this case, I think it is a good thing. But as he would say, you got to remember, it is speculation. It's something we can never know, unfortunately.
The way people were killed, it wasn't the same. It wasn't everyone was shot or whatever.
No, that sure would have made it a lot easier,
right?
From an investigative standpoint. But no, you can probably put them in two categories, and that's, the ones that were obviously violent, and there were many shootings. There was a, it's going to be vividly, I think, portrayed in the movie. There was a house that was dynamited and blown up with 3 people killed in it. So those, I mean, obviously, those didn't take Sherlock Holmes to know that you were dealing with homicides, but there were a lot of others, that were just very quiet, just where the homicide, if in fact that's what it was, just wasn't obvious and would have taken some serious investigation, and in most cases was not done.
And in the article that you wrote about how the total number of victims, we may or we will never know the total number of victims compared to what's officially on record, you talked about a few specific or wrote about a few specific stories. Is there anything about those that you'd want to share on the podcast?
It's difficult, 100 years removed, to find people who can talk about it, or family members that still remember. I guess, centrally, or especially important to our story was, an interview we did with former Osage principal chief Jim Gray, who is the great grandson of one of the pivotal figures, in the whole story, and that was Henry Roan, who was one of the victims. And who was a victim who ultimately it was his slaying that Hale and the others held accountable were charged for. Henry, ended up being a pivotal figure in the story. He was murdered, found, shot in the head. He was one of the early murders. He wasn't the first, but it was his that I think, as we mentioned, really sort of triggered the terror, as we called it. At that point that people could really connect the dots and see that that somebody was out to get these tribal members. But yeah, I think the interview with former Chief Gray about his great grandfather was critical to our story. Because number one, I mean, Henry is so important to the overall story, but also just the insights that Jim Gray could give a contextual understanding of all the forces at work in Henry's life in helping or making him who he was at that point in his life. But yeah, I mean, he never, Jim Gray never had a chance to know his great grandfather. He just knew him through things that his mother would tell him about Henry, who was her grandfather. We one of the interviews we did was with the former executive director of the Osage History Museum in Pawhuska, which is a sort of a repository there of a lot of tribal history and artifacts. So a wonderful place if you ever get a chance to go. But the former executive director of that is a lady who still lives in that area named Catherine Redcorn. She talked to us. She was interviewed by David Grann for his book, Killers of the Flower Moon. And in it, as in our interview, she talks about an exhibit that they did, and that really sort of, I think, from David Grann's own recollections, really sort of launched him on this mission to write this book. And that was an exhibit of photos from tribal members from the early 1900s, many of whom would have been caught up in the Reign of Terror. When they first put this exhibit together, I think Grann came in later and he saw it and was moved by it. But the reason, we want to talk to Catherine about that because that was pivotal. But she has a family story that I think illustrates what a large number of families have been left to live with as far as questions about a relative's demise and not being able to know for sure whether it was connected. She told us about, her grandfather, a man named Raymond Redcorn, who died, and this is important, he died in 1931 of suspicious circumstances. And the reason that's important is that if he died in 1931 and his death is connected to the Reign of Terror, well, that's, the official span was 1921 to 1926 that these killings took place. So if his death was connected, it shows that they span not only further than that, but into the next decade. And, we want to be careful with this because, as she said, we really don't know anything for sure, but there's always been suspicions surrounding her grandfather's death. And that he apparently, based on what things that he said at the time that had been passed on, he believed that his wife at the time in 1931, I believe would have been his second wife, was actually poisoning him. He, from what Catherine and others told us, if you went over to his house during that time period, he would advise you, don't eat anything while you're here, don't drink anything. He clearly believed something was going on. And then what do you know? One day he dies. Now he had a protracted illness. He had been growing weaker. The only thing we can say, and it's really a circumstantial, case, but the evidence does seem to fit the patterns of other other poisonings. And one thing that makes this so difficult is some of these killings it was very obvious that they were homicides. Because they were violent. I mean, like with Henry, who was shot in the head. I mean, there was no denying it. But with many, many others, that people in retrospect now we believe were suspicious. I mean, the cause was just not so obvious. This was an era when poisonings were very common. A lot of murders by poison. And depending on, what the substance was and how it was administered, it could be very hard to detect. Now they could, if they did an autopsy and they did what we would now call a toxicological, do a tox on it, they could determine that poison was present. They did have that capacity then. However, if there was no obvious reason to do it, and you also were dealing with potentially corrupt authorities who were not inclined to look too closely, a lot of these deaths were never investigated.
We have to take a quick break, so don't go too far.
Taking charge of your future starts with taking the first steps. And saving up to $30 a month on Cox Internet with the Affordable Connectivity Program makes those steps easy to take. Whether they bring you to click upload on your first short film or join now for an online book club. Applying is easy. See if you qualify at cox.com/ACP. Non-transferable, one per household. Application and eligibility decisions are made by the FCC.
The Reign of Terror did just that, created an atmosphere of fear in the Osage community. Fear of violence, and fear that authorities weren't going to help even if someone were to speak up. Randy explained how this fear impacted the investigations.
The earliest, it was called the Reign of Terror because people just lived in terror. They were afraid to talk. And when the FBI came in there in 1923 to try and sort things out in their letters and reports and so forth from that time, they talk about how people are just terrified to talk, and they would not talk to outsiders at all. And in fact, has been talked about a lot with this book and movie. They wound up putting some men undercover to try and insinuate themselves into the community so they could get information. And because people were afraid if they told what they knew or what they thought, and they were honest about it, they'd be killed. And this was true of a lot of people. And I think Molly Burkhart at one time, she told her priest that she was afraid. People who were not part of the, and even some of them who were part of these organizations that were doing these things were afraid to talk about it. And sometimes they were afraid to talk about it because they were involved too, but often they were afraid to talk about it because of repercussions against themselves. And, so again, you'd have people just go missing. You have bodies, that would turn up, they'd find them out in the oil field or in a ravine, or you'd have one thing that happened a lot was unexplained deaths. People would, quote, get sick and die. And that happened with Molly Burkhart's mother and at least one of her sisters, where they called it like mysterious wasting disease and things like that. They didn't really have a name for it. And the FBI suspected the local doctor was in on it. That he knew what was going on, and he was, making it worse, or at least not reporting it.
Maybe taking some kickbacks from the perpetrators.
Yes, exactly. Some people, some of these folks suffered from diabetes, and they weren't being now. Treating diabetes, I think, in those days was probably a lot more difficult anyway. But they were not helping it anyway. Mm-hmm. And it was just it was a time when you just had to be careful about every little thing you did and said.
And this is where we wrap things up today. Thanks for listening to Late Edition Crime Beat Chronicles. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next episode. We'll pick up with the investigation and who was held responsible or not for the murders during the Osage Reign of Terror.
Join us for a season of giving. We're the bank for that. Bank of Clark is making it easy to give to local charities. We're featuring a different one at each of our Bank of Clark locations. To find out how you can support the Bank of Clark's Give with BOC campaign, visit our website at bankofclark.bank or follow us on our social media channels and the hashtag GiveWithBOC. Bank of Clark. We're the bank for that. Member FDIC. Equal housing lender.